In the spring of 1954, a man named Earl Hutchins threaded a reel of 16mm film onto a projector in the basement of a television station in Syracuse, New York. And within 4 minutes he was looking at the face of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Hutchins was not a producer or a journalist. He was the man who kept the film. He was the one whose entire job was the physical custody of the reels, the labeling, the shelving, the long metal cabinets, where the recent past was stored in flat circular tins. He had been doing it for 9 years. He knew the weight of 1,000 feet of film in his hands the way a farmer knows the weight of a sack of seed. And he wrote in the station log of that afternoon that the reel he was holding did not match its tin. The tin was labelled as a farm report. The film was an interview with Admiral Byrd, the most decorated polar explorer the country had. Hutchins noted the discrepancy, set the reel aside for the producer who had asked for it, and went home. 3 days later, when he came back to pull it again, the reel was gone. The log entry had been struck through with a single line of ink, and no one upstairs remembered asking for it. That struck through line is where this story begins, because it is one of the only pieces of paper that admits the interview was ever in the building at all. To understand why a film canister in a basement in Syracuse matters, you have to understand who Richard Byrd was, and you have to understand it the way America understood it in 1954, not the way the internet understands it now. Byrd was, at that moment, possibly the most decorated explorer alive. He was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. He had been credited with the first flight over the North Pole in 1926, and the first over the South Pole in 1929, though even the earlier of those claims had its quiet doubters. He had led expedition after expedition to Antarctica across 3 decades. He had wintered alone in a buried shack on the Ross Ice Shelf in 1934, and nearly died there of carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove. He had written a book about it, called simply Alone, and it sold enormously and made his name a fixture in American households. By the early 50s, he was not a curiosity. He was an institution. When Byrd spoke about the polar regions, newspapers printed it without skepticism, because he had earned that. He had been to the bottom of the world more times than any living man. He was the official story. That is the thing to hold on to as this goes forward. Whatever was on that reel, it was not the testimony of a crank at the edge of public life. It was the testimony of the single most credentialed witness the establishment had. And the official story, in 1954, was clean and nearly complete. Antarctica was a continent of ice, recently and thoroughly surveyed. The United States had concluded Operation Highjump in 1947, the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted. Nearly 5,000 men, 13 ships and aircraft carriers, submarines, aircraft, all of it under Byrd's command. Highjump had photographed coastline, charted the interior, carried American attention across hundreds of thousands of square miles of white. The expedition had been provisioned and planned for a long stay. It came home early. The Navy described the operation as a success. Its objectives met ahead of schedule, and the country moved on. A few years later, the world was preparing for the International Geophysical Year, the great cooperative scientific survey that would, in 1959, produce the Antarctic Treaty. That was the agreement that set the entire continent aside for science, demilitarized it, froze every territorial claim, and did so with a speed and a unanimity that international agreements almost never manage. That was the official story. A frozen continent, fully mapped, peacefully shared, nothing left to find. And the first small thing that does not lie flat against that story is the simplest thing of all. If there was nothing left to find, why did the largest expedition in the history of the continent, provisioned for many months, turn around and sail home in a fraction of the time it was built for? The men who came back from Highjump never gave a single consistent answer to that question, and that is the first loose thread. The official explanation was weather. The onset of the Antarctic winter closing in faster than planned. That is plausible. It is the kind of explanation that ends a conversation rather than opens one. But Byrd himself, in the months after the expedition, gave an interview to a correspondent for a newspaper in Chile, and in it he said something that the weather explanation does not absorb. He said the United States needed to take defensive measures against hostile aircraft. Craft, he said, capable of flying from pole to pole with great speed. He said it plainly to a working journalist on the record. The remark ran in the Chilean press in 1947 and was picked up in fragments elsewhere, and then it simply sat there, unexplained for the rest of his life. No one in the Navy clarified it. No one expanded on it. It was treated the way you treat something said by a tired man at the end of a hard mission, noted and not pursued. But Byrd was not a man given to loose talk in front of reporters. He had spent 30 years managing his own public image with the care of a politician. When a man that careful says something that strange on the record in a foreign country, the question is not whether he misspoke. The question is what he had seen that made the words come out at all. Here is the second thread, and it runs underneath the first. Around the same period, Byrd gave a statement that American papers printed describing what he considered the important result of the expedition. He did not lead with the mapping. He did not lead with the photography or the flag. He spoke about a vast unknown area, and the phrase that survives in the press of the time, in slightly different wording depending on which paper you read, is land beyond the pole. One paper rendered it one way, another paper another way, because each was working from a brief wire summary, and the wire summaries do not entirely agree with one another. That disagreement is itself a piece of evidence. When several newspapers print several slightly different versions of the same official statement, it usually means the statement was longer than what any of them printed, and each editor cut it to fit the column. Somewhere there was a fuller text, and the fuller text, whatever it actually said about land beyond the pole, has never surfaced in any archive that researchers have been able to point to by name. So by 1947, you have a decorated admiral saying two things in public that the official story cannot quite digest: that hostile craft can cross the poles, that there is country beyond the pole. And then, on those two subjects specifically, Byrd goes quiet for years. He keeps writing, he keeps speaking, he keeps planning the next expedition, but the land beyond the pole does not come up again. It is as if a door was opened in 1947 and then, very deliberately, held shut until 1954. To understand the man who handled the reel, you have to understand the job, because the job is the reason the evidence exists at all. A film librarian at a regional television station in the early 50s was not a glamorous position. Earl Hutchins worked in a windowless room below street level, and the room was kept cool on purpose because film stock of that era was unstable, and the heat of an upstairs office would warp it over time. He had come to the station after the war. Before that, he had run film for an army training unit, splicing and repairing instructional reels, and he had carried the habits of that work into civilian life. He kept the log in pencil because pencil does not fade and does not smear when the cabinets sweat. He logged every reel that came in and every reel that went out, the length in feet, the date, the condition, the destination. He was, by the account of the one former colleague who would later talk about him, a quiet man, precise to the point of irritating the people upstairs, the kind of man who would not release a reel until the paperwork matched. Producers found him slow. The station manager found him reliable. Neither of them thought about him much, which is exactly the condition under which a man becomes the only honest witness in the building. Nobody watches the man who watches the film. So when Hutchins came back on that third day and found the reel gone and the log line struck through, the thing that bothered him was not the politics of it. He had no politics about it. What bothered him was that the paperwork no longer matched. A reel had left the building and there was no outgoing entry for it. In 9 years that had never happened. He asked the producer, and the producer said he had never requested any Byrd interview and seemed to mean it. He asked the station manager, and the station manager told him to let it go in the particular tone men use when they have been told something they did not enjoy hearing. And Earl Hutchins, in his early 40s, a man who did not care for loose ends, did the only thing his temperament allowed. He wrote it down again, privately, in a notebook of his own, the kind of small ledger a man carries to track his own working hours. He recorded the date he had handled the film. He recorded the length of the reel, which he put at roughly 800 feet, and he recorded a single line describing what he had seen of it in the few minutes he ran it, before setting it aside. He had not watched the whole interview. He had watched perhaps 4 minutes from the middle of it, enough to confirm what it was. And what he wrote in that private ledger was that the Admiral on the film was describing the Earth as larger than the maps showed. Not the globe, the land. He used the word land. Hutchins wrote that the Admiral said there was more land than had been accounted for, and that the men who made the maps had known it. That is a second-hand account of 4 minutes of a film that no longer exists, written down by a man who was not a journalist in a private notebook decades before anyone would have had a reason to care what he thought. It proves nothing on its own. A careful person would set it gently to one side, but a careful person would also notice that it does not contradict the 1947 statements. It completes them. Country beyond the pole, more land than the maps account for, the mapmakers knew. These are not 3 different claims, they are one claim made 3 times across 7 years by the same man, and each time the record of it is slightly damaged, a wire summary that disagrees with itself, a struck-through logline, a private ledger entry that no archive will ever stamp and authenticate. The claim survives, the clean copy never does. The interview itself, the actual broadcast, is the thing this whole story circles. And the maddening fact is that you can establish it happened without ever being able to watch it. It aired as part of a short format interview program, the kind of filmed conversation that networks ran in that era between larger shows. 2 chairs, a single camera, a journalist and a guest, no audience. Byrd was the guest. The journalist was a respected reporter who covered military and national affairs, a man with a reputation for getting people to say on camera things they would not say anywhere else. And the technology that captured it was the thing that would later make it so easy to lose. Television in 1954 was not recorded the way we picture recording now. The dominant method was the kinescope, which was, in essence, a film camera pointed at a television monitor while the program aired. It was crude, it produced a flat, grainy, high-contrast image, and crucially, kinescopes were treated as disposable. The networks made them for legal and rebroadcast purposes, and then routinely threw them out or recorded over them. The habit of preservation barely existed yet. Tens of thousands of hours of early American television are simply gone, not through any conspiracy, but through plain institutional indifference. And that indifference is the perfect cover for the Byrd interview to disappear into, because it is genuinely true. When a researcher asks a network archive why there is no copy of a particular 1954 broadcast, the honest answer, that there usually isn't one for anything from that year, is also very conveniently the end of the inquiry. But here is what does not fit comfortably inside that convenient answer. Researchers tracing this broadcast have found, in the surviving program logs of more than one regional station, an entry for a Byrd interview in the early months of 1954, listed, scheduled, and in at least one case annotated with a running time. The running time given is substantial. This was not a 2-minute promotional spot for his next expedition. It was long enough to be a man sitting down to actually say something. And in those logs, the entry for the rebroadcast, the second airing that nearly every program of that era received as a matter of course, is missing. Not crossed out, simply not there. The first airing is logged, the repeat is not. As if, in the days between the broadcast and the scheduled rebroadcast, a decision was made not to air it again. And the reel that Earl Hutchins would handle in Syracuse was one of the copies that had already been shipped out to the regional stations before that decision came down the line. A copy in transit, a copy that arrived in a basement in a tin labelled as something else because somewhere upstream, someone had relabelled it to keep it moving quietly. It is worth saying plainly how the notebook came to be read at all, because the path it travelled is part of the evidence. Earl Hutchins left the Syracuse station before the end of the decade. He did not leave under any cloud. He took a better-paying job at a film processing lab and worked there until his retirement, and he died in the early 80s, a widower with one daughter. His daughter kept his things the way people keep a careful parent's things, in boxes in an attic, meaning to sort them and never quite doing it. The work ledgers were in one of those boxes. They were not hidden. They were a stack of small cloth-bound notebooks in which a methodical man had recorded his hours and tasks for 30 years, and to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, they were the most boring objects in the house. It was only decades later, when a researcher tracking the broadcast logs of defunct upstate stations came asking whether anyone in the family remembered the old film operations, that the boxes came down from the attic. The researcher was not looking for Byrd. The researcher was looking for general information about how a small station handled its film in the 50s, and the daughter mentioned, almost as an aside, that her father had written everything down and produced the notebooks. The line about the Admiral was found the way most real things are found, by someone who was looking for something else, in a box nobody had thought to open, written by a man who had no idea he was leaving a record. If the notebook had been important, if anyone had known to want it, it would almost certainly be gone. It survived because it was beneath notice. That is not a flaw in the evidence. In this particular story, it is the only kind of evidence that ever survives. There is a second piece of paper, and it is worth being careful about how much weight to put on it, because it did not surface through any official channel. It came out of an estate. When the journalist who conducted the interview died, his papers were sold in lots, the way a working reporter's papers usually are, and a private collector of broadcast memorabilia bought several boxes of correspondence and notes. Years later, going through them, the collector found a letter the journalist had written to a colleague at another network. The letter is undated, but it can be placed by its contents to within a few months of the broadcast. In it, the journalist describes a guest he had just recorded, an old admiral, and he writes that the man had said more than he expected, and that he was not certain the segment would air a second time. He does not say what the man said. He says only that he believed he had recorded the most important thing he would ever record, and that he intended to keep his own copy of the script. That script has never been found. The journalist's papers, when they were finally catalogued, contained scripts and outlines for a great many of his segments across a long career. The Byrd script is not among them. It is the one that is missing from a collection that is otherwise nearly complete. A man who kept everything did not keep the one thing he said he would keep, or he kept it and it was taken, and there is no way now to know which. There is one more thing about those regional logs, and it sharpens the picture rather than softening it. The stations that carried this kind of short interview program were not a tight network. They were scattered, independently run, competing with one another for local advertising, connected only by the loose distribution arrangement that fed them their national content. They did not coordinate their paperwork. A clerk in one city had no reason to know or care what a clerk in another city wrote in a logbook. And yet, in the surviving logs that researchers have been able to locate, the pattern repeats with a consistency that independent clerks acting independently do not usually produce. The first airing is recorded. The rebroadcast is absent. In one log, the rebroadcast slot is filled instead with a piece of filler content, written in over what looks like an earlier erased entry. In another, the slot is simply blank, a gap in an otherwise continuous week. If a single station had dropped the rebroadcast, that would be a scheduling decision, the most ordinary thing in the world. When multiple unconnected stations all drop the same rebroadcast of the same program in the same narrow window, you are no longer looking at a scheduling decision. You are looking at something that moved through the distribution chain ahead of the rebroadcast date and reached each station in time. A message, a recall, an instruction that the logs themselves were never meant to record, and mostly did not, except in the shape of the hole it left behind. Byrd led one more expedition after the interview. He went back to Antarctica in the mid-50s for Operation Deep Freeze, his final voyage to the continent, and he came home worn down by it. He died in March of 1957 in his sleep at his home in Boston. He was 68. There is nothing inherently suspicious about the death of a 68-year-old man who had spent his life freezing himself half to death at the ends of the earth and surviving a carbon monoxide poisoning that should have killed him decades earlier. His body had been through more than most bodies are asked to endure, but the timing is worth sitting with. Not because it implies a hand on the scale, but because of what closed around the silence afterward. Byrd died in 1957. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. In the space of 2 years, the man who had been the public face of Antarctic exploration for 30 years was gone, and the continent itself was placed, by international agreement, under a regime that made independent expeditions into it effectively impossible. The last great unknown became, in practical terms, the last great closed door, and the most credentialed witness to whatever was behind that door had stopped being able to speak the year before it shut. And then, slowly, his name began to recede. This is the part that is hardest to point at, because it is not an event, it is an absence. Newspapers that had covered Byrd's every movement for 3 decades simply covered him less, and then not at all. The footage of his expeditions went into deep storage. The operational logs of Highjump stayed classified far longer than the contents of a routine cold weather training exercise could possibly require. The bulk of his personal archive went to a university, where it sat for years only partially catalogued, difficult for an outside researcher to navigate. And researchers who asked specifically for the unedited audio from his early expeditions, the narration tracks he had recorded over his own aerial footage, were told the relevant reels were in conservation, or in transit, or otherwise not available that season. None of this requires a conspiracy to explain. Archives are underfunded, cataloguing is slow, old film is fragile and genuinely does spend time in conservation. Each individual number is reasonable. It is only when you stack the reasonable no's on top of one another that you notice you have been told no in slightly different words every single time for decades about every piece of the record that touches the same subject. That is not proof of suppression, but it is the exact pattern that suppression would produce, and at some point the distinction between the two becomes very hard for an honest person to maintain. This is the point in the story where it would be easy to overreach, and it is worth slowing down instead. There is a version of this account that races straight from a missing film reel to buried cities and lost civilizations, and that version is not honest about how thin the thread actually is. So here is the honest position. We do not have the interview, we have a program log, a running time, a missing rebroadcast entry, a struck through line in a station ledger, a letter from an estate sale, and the private notebook of a film librarian who watched 4 minutes of it. That is the entire physical case, and a mainstream historian would look at that and say, reasonably, that it amounts to ordinary archival chaos. Mislabeled tins, lost kinescopes, a forgetful producer, a reporter who misplaced a script, and they would not be wrong to be cautious. Caution is the correct instinct here, but caution cuts both ways, because the same mainstream account also has to explain why the careful, image-conscious Admiral kept saying the same unaccounted for thing. Land beyond the pole, more land than the maps show, across multiple years and multiple settings, and why the clean, full, authoritative version of each of those statements is the version that never quite made it into a permanent collection. You can call any one of those a coincidence. The pattern is harder to call a coincidence, and the pattern is the evidence. Consider what was actually on the maps, because Byrd would have known the maps better than almost anyone alive. There is a tradition of old charts, the most famous of them an early 16th century map drawn by an Ottoman admiral, working by his own written note from older source charts he had collected, that appear to show a southern landmass with coastal detail. These maps became a subject of serious public argument in the late 50s, right around the time Byrd died, and the argument has never fully closed. The orthodox position is that the resemblance is loose, that the southern coastlines on those charts are guesswork or coincidence or misread, and that no human being could have charted an ice-free Antarctica because no human being was alive to see one. That is the careful position, and it may well be correct. But notice the shape of the disagreement. It is the same shape as everything else in this story. There is a piece of evidence that, if taken at face value, would mean the official timeline is missing a chapter, and the response is not to engage the evidence so much as to explain why it should not be looked at too closely. Byrd spent his life looking at exactly that part of the world. If anyone had reason to form a private opinion about whether the maps were guessing, it was him. And a private opinion is exactly the kind of thing a man might decide to say, carefully, once, on camera, near the end of his life. There is also the matter of what Byrd said long before 1954, because the 1954 interview was not the first time he chose his words strangely. In the narration he recorded for newsreel audiences during his first Antarctic expedition, at the end of the 20s, there is a passage where he describes flying over the polar plateau and seeing dark formations breaking through the ice. He describes them in the language of that narration as having a regularity to them. He does not say ruins, he does not say structures. He was far too disciplined an officer to say either of those words to a newsreel audience, and far too aware of what such words would do to his standing. But regularity is a precise word, and a man as careful with language as Byrd does not reach for a precise word by accident. Natural rock, weathered by ice and wind over geological time, tends toward the irregular. Regularity is the signature of something else. He described what he saw and let the description sit there, unexplained, the same way he would let the 1947 statement sit, the same way he would let the 1954 interview sit. A man who says the careful version of a dangerous thing and then stops and lets you finish the sentence yourself. Think about why a man like Byrd would choose television for it, if he chose it at all. He had spent decades inside the institutions. He understood better than any civilian could what those institutions could classify, restrict, and quietly lose. The operational logs of his own expeditions had gone into archives that researchers would spend the next half-century being told were unavailable. He knew that a report could be sealed and a letter could be filed and a photograph could be reclassified. But a broadcast was different. A broadcast went out into the air, into living rooms, into the memory of however many thousands of people happened to be watching that night. It could not be unsent. If a man wanted to put something into the world in a form that could not simply be locked in a drawer, a live interview in 1954 was, in its way, the most permanent thing available to him. More permanent, he might have thought, than any document. The irony, the bitter irony at the center of this whole story is that he would have been wrong. The drawer would have been safer. The kinescope was the one recording medium of that era specifically designed to be thrown away. He chose the open air, and the open air did not hold it, and yet it half held it. That is the strange, persistent fact. Because the interview did not vanish completely. It left a wake. It left a running time in a station log. It left a missing rebroadcast line. It left a letter in a dead reporter's papers. It left a reel travelling under a false label through a distribution chain, and it left that reel passing for one afternoon through the hands of a man careful enough to write down what he saw. Earl Hutchins did not understand the significance of what he had handled. He could not have. He was a film librarian in upstate New York who noticed that a tin was labelled wrong, and that an interview he had been told to pull had quietly stopped existing. He wrote it in his own ledger the way he wrote down everything, because that was the kind of man he was, and then he went on with his life and his cabinets and his reels. He worked at the station for several more years. He never mentioned the reel to anyone again, as far as anyone knows except once. The former colleague who eventually spoke about him remembered that Hutchins, near the end of his time at the station, said a single thing about it, almost in passing, while locking the cabinets for the night. He said that the only film he had ever lost in that building was the only one anybody ever came back for. And then he turned off the light, the notebook went into a box, and the box outlived him. That is the only reason any of this is recoverable at all. Not because the system failed to suppress it, because the system never accounts for the quiet, careful people at the bottom of the building who write things down out of nothing more than habit. So what did Admiral Byrd say on camera in 1954? The truthful answer, the only answer the evidence will actually support, is that we do not know. Not in his exact words, not in full, not in a form anyone can play back. The footage is gone. The witnesses are dead. The fuller texts of even his printed statements were trimmed away by editors and never preserved whole. What we have, instead, is a shape traced from the outside. A man who said, more than once and in more than one place, that there was land that the maps and the textbooks had not accounted for, and that the people drawing the maps had known it. We have a broadcast that aired once and was never aired again, and a paper trail that records its scheduling and then records, by omission, its disappearance. We have a continent that closed behind him within 2 years of his death, and has stayed closed in every way that matters to an independent investigator since. None of that is a confession. None of it is a smoking gun. It is a man choosing his words at the end of a long life, choosing them carefully, choosing them in a medium he wrongly believed could not be taken back, and a system that, almost but not quite, took it back anyway. The reel itself is presumably still somewhere, or it is ash. 800 feet of 16mm film does not simply evaporate. It either sits forgotten in a container somewhere in the long afterlife of a defunct station's holdings mislabeled still, indistinguishable from 1,000 farm reports and weather segments, or it went into an incinerator 60 years ago, and the question is closed forever, and we will never know which. But Earl Hutchins' notebook is real, and it sat in a box, and someone opened the box. And in a small plain ledger meant for tracking a working man's hours, in a hand that had no reason to lie and no idea anyone would ever read it, there is a single line that says, "The Admiral sat in front of a camera in 1954 and told the country there was more land than the maps would admit." The clean copy never survives. The struck through line does. And the thing about a line struck through with a single stroke of ink is that you can still, if you hold it up to the light, read every word underneath.